Hi everyone, my name's Dr. Matt Williams. I'm a tutor in politics and what is known as the Access Fellow here at Jesus College at the University of Oxford. Now, we are going to launch a bit of a study skills series of videos in response to demand that we've received from lovely comments. So do please keep your comments coming in if you would like anything in particular to be helpful, but also just generally because the whole point of this channel is to share all of the cheat codes on how to succeed in higher education. And that can include being admitted to competitive universities, but also then thriving when you are at university or if you're struggling at school or college. Today's topic is on reading. And the point of starting with reading is because I suspect there's a bit of a conspiracy of silence around some study skills insofar as universities and schools and colleges are getting a lot better at supporting learners with difficulties that they encounter in their study skills. But there can be a sort of a barrier to even asking for help on some of the fundamentals because people think it's too basic, I shouldn't be struggling with this sort of stuff. And yet almost everyone does struggle with it. So it's the sort of thing where we ought to be more open and more honest with each other about it. And reading is a prime example of this. Who wants to admit they struggle with reading? I do now. In middle age, I'll put my hand up and say, yeah, I really struggle with it. I've got some particular reasons for that. In particular, I was born partially sighted and the disability has made it very difficult for me to read at pace. But I also just struggle anyway, even with assistive technologies, even with all sorts of support. Reading is tiring. It can be boring sometimes, honestly. And so finding out some good strategies to make reading successful and fast and efficient is what we're going to be talking about today, because it's one of the most important skills that you can develop. And yet I think we somehow sort of talk about reading as the sort of skill that you should have developed by the end of primary school, when in fact it's a lifelong mission. So where should we even start? I mean, just for a bit of context, one of the papers I teach for here at Oxford is called Comparative Government. It's a political science paper and it's taken by second year students at the university typically. And the reading list for the comparative government course is about 90 pages long for an 8-week tutorial course. So the reading list is 90 pages, okay? And it must contain, about 1,000 different things that can be read, books, academic papers, and so on. It's an extraordinary amount. And I remember when I was first teaching it and studying it, just feeling completely overwhelmed. It's like, oh my goodness. And of course, in universities, you might go and visit a tutor in their office hour and you look in their office and they've got shelves a bit like these that are lined with books and you think, right, I don't really want to have to confess to you that I struggle getting through the reading because you don't. And I don't want you to sort of see through the cracks of my mask and sort of realize that, oh, maybe I'm not up to this, right? So hence the conspiracy of silence, hence why we don't necessarily confess that we find reading a struggle. But we should, because reading is difficult, especially if you're reading academic texts and especially if you're reading them at pace. So I've got a couple of fundamental tips. The first of which is that fast reading is all about decision making. You mustn't read books like they're novels when you come to university. In other words, you're not going to read them from cover to cover and you're not going to sort of pore over them and you're not going to remember everything and you're not going to be quoting out of them verbatim. What you need to do is behave like you're a detective crossed with a prosecutor. Someone like Sherlock Holmes, you're investigating a crime. And that means that when you pick up a book or an academic paper, you're thinking, what is the information I need out of this text in order to further my case? Okay, so that means that you mustn't read anything, not a word, until you know what it is that you need to be looking for. So let's say you've got an essay you need to write. You must be thinking carefully about what sorts of arguments you might like to make on the essay before you read a thing. What can commonly happen is that students just start reading and then they think about the essay later. That's the wrong way around. You start thinking about the essay and then you do the reading, because then your reading will be targeted and focused because you're in the mind of a detective, you're Sherlock Holmes, you know what you're hunting for, and you're reading as a decision maker. You're not reading passively. You're not just sort of starting at page 1 and finishing at page infinity and just letting the words just wash over your brain like, oh, this is not going in. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing and it's taking so much time and I'm so tired. Okay, so reading has to be targeted. It has to be based on decisions. It has to be strategic. Specific decisions that you need to make are with regards to what is essential for your piece of work, your essay or whatever it is, what could be helpful but maybe not essential, and what is optional. And then you need to very ruthlessly organize your time. If you've only got a limited amount of time, which is typical to write a paper, then you need to figure out how to time all of those things. So it's a good idea, not only before you start reading, to think about the essay question and what you need to be hunting for in the readings, but also to start prioritizing your time compartmentalization. Now, hopefully the reading list is curated in some way, that the tutors should give you some guidance as to what readings are more or less essential. But it's also on you to figure out what information you need to extract. And so the next thing you need to do is to break up the essay and think about the sorts of information and data that you need to extract from your reading. Now, this is a generalization, but almost any academic activity can be split up into 6 elements, okay? Those being concepts, meta theory, theory, methods, data, and results. Basically the structure of a scientific paper. Now that applies even to English literature, okay? Authors and secondary literary criticism will talk about various ideas, concepts. They will talk about the scope of those ideas, which is meta theory. They will talk about theories of change and causation, which is theory. They will have methods for communicating those ideas, which is methods. They will have data, kind of. Literature doesn't always necessarily have data, but data is words in literature, and there will be results of all of that. Now, when you read an essay question, you need to figure out what of those 6 parts are you most in need of in your hunt as a detective, as a Sherlock Holmes, in the crime scene, which is the reading list, so to speak. You need to figure out which of those 6 things you need to prioritize. And then you need to do a bit of a triage. So go into the book, look in the introduction, look in the contents page, look in the index and so on, and find the specifics of those 6. So let me give you an example from my own field, from political science. So the students who are studying comparative government might have to write an essay on democratization, or the spread or the retreat of democracies around the world. So the concept of democracy is obviously very important. If your essay is about what democracy even means, then you know to focus your reading on those aspects. So you can either go through a physical book looking for references to democracy and how it's defined, or if you've got an online paper, you can Control F and look for the word democracy or the concept and how it's argued about. You do not need to start at the beginning and finish at the end. And if you do, you're not being a decision-making reader, you're being a passive reader. So that's concepts. Meta theory is the scope conditions of theory. So if we've got a theory about how democracy might advance or retreat, the meta theory is how much of time and space that extends to. So for example, I've got a theory that democratization depends on a vibrant middle class. Maybe that theory only applies to certain parts of the world at certain times, in which case my meta theory is that it's constrained in some way. So that's meta theory. If I'm interested in meta theory from my essay, then that's the sort of thing I need to go hunting for in the readings. The theory is perhaps the part of the story that we focus on most in academic work. It's what causes stuff to happen. It's the storytelling. And in that instance, we can, of course, again, focus our reading on what an author's theories are. We're trying to extract their argument, and we're doing so because we want to make an argument, right? We want to make our own argument in an essay. So what you're not doing is just passively recording someone's argument. And we're going to have a session on note-taking, a video on note-taking shortly. But you're not just going to passively say, this is what so-and-so argues. You're going to say what you think about what so-and-so argues. Because remember, you are a hard-nosed Sherlock Holmes-like detective in this case. So you're trying to find out the theory, but in order to advance your own theory, okay? The next level is methods, like how does someone go about trying to test their theory? Then you've got the data. What sort of sources of information do they use? All data is incomplete. All data is incomplete, even that which is scrubbed off the internet. So no one has a full picture on anything. So what picture or what fragments of the picture does this particular author utilize is something that you can go and find relatively quickly. And what are the results and what do they say? And do they seem robust? And do they seem convincing? And so on. So it's those 6 levels of analysis that any essay will deal with. You probably won't have to deal with all 6, but that means you can compartmentalize. You can focus your reading. You can go as a detective into the crime scene that is your reading list, and you figure, right, this author is talking a lot about concepts. I need to talk a lot about concepts. I'm going to focus on that. When I open their book, I'm going to do a bit of triage. I'm going to figure out these chapters, focus in particular on concepts, so I'm going to focus on them, or I can just control F and I can find passages that deal with the concepts. You have to be kind of ruthless. You can't just sort of ingratiate yourself with the author and read the whole thing and think, oh, this is lovely, because you don't have time. And if you've got to get through a 90-odd page reading list, you've got to be really ruthless about it and take about sort of 20, 30 minutes on a paper or a book and move on, unless, and this is where we come on to deep dives, unless there is a particularly good reason why you ought to dive deeper into some certain aspects. Some of the reasons why you might dive deeper into particular authors or particular works is because they are especially important to the essay or the paper you're trying to write, that the case you're making as your Sherlock Holmes hinges on them. So it could be a seminal author, for example. It could be a primary document. In other words, you might be analysing an original piece of writing from an author and you're trying to engage with it critically. Even then, reading from start to finish is totally inefficient. In most cases, it's just not going to work. Even then, you still need to be targeted. You still need to figure out, what do I need to get out of this piece, in quite a ruthless, hard-nosed assessment. But you can, again, sort of search like a detective into some more details that many people would miss. You could go into the appendices, you could go into the footnotes. As a tutor, it's very impressive when someone has gone deep because they know they're hunting for some information that will be particularly critical. And so again, reading is about decision making. It's not about sort of passively just starting at the beginning and finishing at the end, because you're just not going to get through it. You're going to tire yourself out and you're going to think, I barely read one book and I've been asked to read 20. What's going on? What am I doing wrong? Well, what you're doing wrong is that you're not taking decisions. You're reading passively. You're not being a detective. You're letting the reading list just wash all over you. So you've got to be more ruthless about it. So just to sum up, as I say, this is something I've always struggled with, and not just because of my disability, but just because it is really hard. I do think that people are not sufficiently open about it. That the assumption is, well, reading is easy, everyone can read. But actually, reading at pace and at scale is not easy. And it is a skill that you have to develop. And being a skill that you have to develop means that you're going to get some things wrong and you're going to struggle at times. But the crucial thing to remember is that you need to read with the mindset of a detective. You can't go into the reading list without knowing what crime it is that you're investigating, so to speak. You've got to be making decisions. You've got to be targeted with your resources. And honestly, spending about sort of 20, 30 minutes with a paper, 40 or so minutes with a book is usually sufficient. Of course, later, when it comes to revision, you can come back to it. And you don't need to be taking extensive notes because the book will still be there. You can use that as the repository of all the information. The notes you'll be taking, which we'll go on to talk about in our next video, are just to help you come up with your argument. So stay tuned. Let me know in the comments what you think. Let me know if you need any other similar videos. We'd love to hear your ideas because we're making a bit of a series on these study skills. And let's try and break this conspiracy of silence. Reading is hard. It is scary on occasions. It can be unpleasant. And I think sometimes people are not ready to admit that, but I am. And I hope you are ready to come with me on this journey. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. All the best. Bye now.